Salve Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex famundo lux extorta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes.
Welcome to the last session of Friday's conference. My job here is to introduce the introducer once again. The Honorable James L. Buckley is perhaps the only man in our century to serve in all three branches of government as Undersecretary of State, United States Senator from New York, and also as a senior judge. More importantly to us, he's the father of Peter. I was Peter's prefect, that's why he's not here at the moment. Jay and Billy, grandfather of Sean, Anna, and Jimmy, uncle of Christopher and Hunt, and we're very, very proud to have you here today, sir.
And also my brother-in-law is a graduate, class of 1940. I'm supposed to drag my heels because my son Jimmy, who is a lifeguard somewhere else, was hoping to terminate his responsibilities and get here on time. But anyway, he's here. I feel very privileged to introduce Roger Kimball. If you were to Google him, you would find that he is the co-editor and publisher of the New Criterion, which happens to be today's premier journal of enlightened cultural and social commentary. He is also president and publisher of Encounter Books, author of innumerable volumes on the arts and education, chronicler of our cultural decline, contributor to large numbers of popular and scholarly publications both here and abroad, and a sought-after lecturer. He is, in short, an overachiever. And as overachievers have a habit of discovering one another, it was inevitable that his and my brother Bill's paths should cross, and having crossed, that they should become fast friends. And as they found they shared a nostalgia for the beauties and mysteries of the pre-Vatican II Catholic liturgy, it was also inevitable that my brother should invite him to attend the private Tridentine Masses celebrated by Father Kevin Fitzgerald at a chapel near Bill's home, which Mr. Kimball proceeded to do for 5 or 6 years before Bill's death. When Bill died, Father Fitzpatrick was asked to celebrate the very private Latin Requiem Mass for Bill in Sharon, Connecticut, where we all grew up and where Bill is now buried. During his homily, he mentioned that he had once asked Bill whether he had ever had doubts about his faith. The answer was no. Father Fitzpatrick expressed wonder at the answer because he had never before heard such an affirmation of a lifelong certainty that God is indeed in his heaven and that the Roman Catholic Church is his instrument here on earth. The good father's surprise is understandable because he had no reason to know the sources of Bill's extraordinary faith, namely our mother and our parents' unusual history, unusual at least for Americans. To begin with the latter, they had actually witnessed religious persecution and had sacrificed for their faith. At the time of their marriage, my father had been living in Mexico for 12 years, where he practiced law and engaged in oil and land development, and their first home was in the Mexican city of Tampico. At that time, priests were being executed, and the celebration of the Mass was forbidden by the local authorities. Our mother used to tell us of receiving telephone calls from friends advising her that a plumber or a carpenter would be visiting their home at a particular time. Code for the fact that a priest would be going to that house at that time to say a clandestine Mass. And it was in substantial part because of my father's very public denunciation of the church's persecution that he was expelled from Mexico, had his properties confiscated, and at age 40 had to begin his life all over again. That he knew was the risk of speaking out, but he felt he had to. But it was my mother who set the spiritual tone in our home. Hers was not an oppressive piety, and she was far more than a daily communicant. She simply radiated her belief in and dependence on a caring God, whose love she totally and unaffectedly reciprocated. My mother's faith was such an inherent part of her persona that although her obituary and National Review didn't dwell on her spirituality, Bill couldn't avoid allusions to it. And so the obit was peppered with such statements as, there were rules she lived by, chief among them those she understood good God to have specified. Her anxiety to do the will of God was more than ritual. Her grief was profound, and she emerged from it through the solvent of prayer, her belief in submission to a divine order. And she never complained because, she explained, she could never repay God for the favors he had done her, no matter what tribulations she might need to suffer, and her mother had her share of tribulations. Given my father's sacrifice for his faith, given our mother's example of a life sustained by it, given our love and respect for our parents, it would have been an unseemly act of filial arrogance for Bill to repudiate the beliefs that had permeated and sustained our home. This, I believe, explains the absolute conviction reflected in Bill's statement that he had never, ever entertained any doubts about his Catholic faith. But as Mr. Kimball will likely inform us, this did not mean that Bill suspended his critical faculties when it came to actions by some of the Lord's servants here on earth, and not only because they banished the Tridentine Mass. In fact, one papal pronouncement he disapproved of caused Bill to scandalize fellow Catholics by proclaiming, Mater si, magistra no. Roger, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's such a beautiful day. I've never been here before. It's such a beautiful place. It's walking around the campus before coming here, you can really feel not only the natural beauty, but it's a place that's instinct, I think, with something more. I've called this this little talk WFD on the Mass and Other Earthly Delights. I chose that title because I think that for Bill, the two were intertwined. He didn't see the Mass as something opposed to earthly delights, but rather, in a way, one of them. In the capacious personal Index Locutionum Prohibitorum of William F. Buckley, Jr., I suspect that the most depressing entry was one that will be familiar to anyone who's been exposed to Catholic liturgy in its contemporary, which is to say, in its populist manifestation. I mean, of course, the chilling 10-word enjoinment, let us all give each other a sign of peace. Now that oleaginous hebdomadal injunction was possibly even more distasteful to Bill than another common offender, namely, why don't we skip drinks and go directly into dinner? You didn't often see Bill Buckley nonplussed, but his famous, day-brightening smile would first falter and then stiffen into a melancholy rictus of foreboding when he encountered, without preparation, the suggestion that the evening repast, or even the afternoon one, should commence without the accustomed libation and liquid go to conviviality. I confess that I was at one with him about that. He always, I think, regarded it as something of an ambush and would gaze about with a sad, interrogatory look that clearly said, "Why didn't someone warn me about this?" Fortunately, it didn't happen often, and never, I'd wager, twice in the same establishment. More inescapable, alas, was the liturgical deformation I mentioned above. I sometimes wonder whether the sign of peace routine wasn't contrived by some hardened enemy of the church. Perhaps it was the same cabal responsible for the new habit of applauding the priest at every opportunity. Or perhaps it was the older brother of the author of the Da Vinci Code. At any rate, the sign of peace wheeze is a supremely effective prophylactic against concentration. Part of what Bill, in an essay on the end of the Latin Mass, called the fascistic static of the contemporary Mass. We approach the most solemn part of the ceremony. A communal recitation of the Lord's Prayer quietly affirms the individual's place in the congregation without trespassing upon the essential privateness of the moment. Then, pow! We're enjoined to abandon that prayerful solicitude and take a few moments to press the flesh with a circle of random churchgoers who just happen to be in our vicinity. Would a fire drill be any more effective in disrupting the mood appropriate to the celebration of the awful mystery of the Mass than that misguided exercise in demonic bonhomiousness? Well, I raised that complaint one summer day several years ago when Bill and I were sailing on Long Island Sound. And soon thereafter, as Jim mentioned, he sent me an email with what he rightly described as an extraordinary invitation. I live in Connecticut, not far from Stamford, where Bill lived. His invitation was to join him and 3 or 4 other souls for Sunday Mass in a chapel attached to a local church. It transpired that, for a decade or more, Bill had contrived to have Latin Mass in the Tridentine right there, said by a friendly priest who lived in a nearby town. Actually, not that nearby, but people did would go out of their way to help Bill. In his invitation, Bill described the performance as faintly against the rules. I believe I'm correct in saying that, at least when he embarked on these semi-private celebrations, there was nothing at all faint about the transgression. The prejudice against the traditional Latin Mass has weakened in recent years, and that's a good thing. But at the time, the prohibition was unmistakably distinct, not faint at all. It was not, however, beyond appeal, since Bill managed to receive official approval, if not quite an official blessing, for his weekly convocations. Now, there were many things that Bill liked about the arrangement. No sign of peace, it goes without saying. And there was also the majesty, and for someone of Bill's generation, the comforting familiarity of the Latin language. Somehow, credo in unum Deum Patrem omnipotentem has a grandeur that the vernacular lacks. And the traditional liturgy itself has a force, a logic, and a stateliness its successor fails to achieve. Ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meum, to God who imparts joy to my youth. That formula, repeated several times at the beginning of the traditional Mass, expresses an acknowledgement of and a gratitude for God's grace that is missing from the contemporary liturgy. I think Bill cherished the opportunity of Thanksgiving. And think about someone like Bill who had been saying those words for 70, 80 years. There were other things Bill liked about his private Mass. When he first issued the invitation, he lamented the lack of music, but advertised as selling points that the Mass was, of course, without homily, and, quote, lasts exactly 1/2 hour. It did, too. The late, lamented Father Kevin Fitzpatrick, whom Jim mentioned, who died last July at the absurdly young age of 52, managed the journey from opening bells to donning the biretta after prayers at the foot of the altar in anything from 27 to 36 minutes. Not, of course, that I always kept track, I'm just reporting the figures. Some people I've mentioned this to are slightly taken aback that a devout Catholic such as Bill would count brevity among the advantages of the Mass. Well, they shouldn't have been taken aback, and I'll come back to some reasons why in a moment. For now, I want to take a moment to pay grateful tribute to Bill for including me and my wife in that refuge from the handshaking Sign of Peace Brigade. For some 6 years, we joined him most Sundays in that little chapel next to St. Mary's Church. If Father Kevin were unavailable one week, we'd often go to another local church. And we soon added the secular ritual of repairing after Mass to Bill's house on Wallack's Point, where he and my wife would play duets on the piano or harpsichord, as the case might be. Then, often with Bill's wife, Pat, we would convene for pre-prandial refreshment, which sometimes stretched into watching 60 Minutes and dinner. My last meeting with Bill was on Sunday, February 24th, 2008, and it was at Mass. Though we had planned to go back to his house as usual, he was too weak for any conviviality that evening. He was, however, looking forward to an evening of piano music, followed by dinner at his house a few days later. I spoke to him about it Monday night. Our mutual friend, Larry Perlman, who I believe played for you last night, was scheduled to play Beethoven's Diabelli Variations for a small group on Wednesday, February 27th. I had a call from Bill's longtime friend and assistant, Linda Bridges, at about 10 o'clock that morning. Bill had died earlier that day in the Buckley equivalent of the saddle, namely sitting at his desk in his study, computer humming, papers and books for a dozen projects piled up around him. I said that I would return to the question of why Bill counted the brevity of Father Kevin's Mass as an advantage. It had, I think, something to do with Bill's understanding of prayer and his appreciation of the gift of time. Bill was the opposite of ostentatious in his religious observances, but any close friend could see that prayer occupied an important place in the spiritual economy of his life. I think he would have liked what the novelist Anthony Trollope had to say about such matters. In the late 1850s, Trollope wrote that, quote, "A man in his short sojourn here has mainly 3 things to do, and he should endeavor to do them all well. He has to say his prayers, he has to earn his bread, and he has to amuse himself." I suppose we might cavil over the deflationary phrase, amuse himself. Perhaps engage or occupy would have been better. But in essentials, I think, Bill would have smiled on Trollope's enumeration of duties. And it was a prelude, the recognition, that our sojourn here on earth is ineluctably short, be it full of years, as Bill's was, or like that of Lessing's son, numbered in hours only, that distributes the weight of the obligations articulated. Pascal gave classic expression to the unsettling side of this phenomenon. "When I consider," he wrote, "the short duration of my life, absorbed by eternity before and after, memoria hospitis unius diei praeteriontus, in the memory of a guest who tarries for 1 day only, the little space I fill, in which I see swallowed up in the infinite vastness of spaces that I do not know and that do not know me, I am frightened and astonished by seeing myself here rather than there, as there is no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. Who put me here? By whose order and guidance were this place and this time assigned to me?" Pascal expresses the discomforting aspect of this humbling recognition, the side that pushes people into graduate seminars in philosophy or other types into the therapist's couch. Bill did not have much time for this allotrope of existential anxiety. He recognized, as he put it in his magnificent account of his visit to Lourdes, that, quote, "from the day of birth, we are on our deathbed." But if he found in it a private inspiration to prayer, he publicly embraced it as a goad to action and enjoyment, not paralysis. His focus was adamantly outward, blissfully involved in the particulars of his latest adventure. Socrates may or may not have been right that the unexamined life is not worth living. Bill indisputably demonstrated that the unexamined world just won't cut it. The entertainment committee, he liked to say, never sleeps. Anyone who knew Bill knew that he was gloriously impatient. But his impatience was of a piece with another quality, not always recognized: his irrepressible curiosity about the animating mechanics of the world around him. This impetus percolated through the fibers of his being, I think, right down to the filaments of his literary style. Bill's style of writing was at once seductively confidential. He always seemed to be writing for you, and at the same time, magnificently selfless. Bill's love of gadgets comes in here too. It's been oft remarked. He always had the latest radar, then the Loran-C, then GPS. Whatever new gadget came out, he had it. In many ways, I think, he regarded the entire world as his gadget. And he never considered a gadget fully mastered until he had both plumbed its intricacies and anatomized them for his chosen readership. His writing was didactic without didacticism. Sailing, skiing, playing the piano or harpsichord, learning celestial navigation, decisions about word usage or online dictionaries, animadversions about the habit of serving a salad course at public functions. I know I'll never do that again. The particular virtues and defining idiosyncrasies of friends, colleagues, debating partners, even pets. He writes an essay about the life of a public speaker, and you do not simply eavesdrop on a notable practitioner of that art. You feel its rewards and its rigors from within. You also get passels of valuable, practical advice. I just happened to stumble upon Keyboard Classics, Piano Stylists from July, August 1994. You happen to have a stack of these back home, and in the back cover, we have William F. Buckley Jr.'s Getting Back to the Piano. For fallen away pianists and beginners too, makes learning pure fun. It was the Buckley method of musical notation that guaranteed to speed up your absorption of any piece of music. I don't know whether it works or not, but it was characteristic of Bill. Or consider his advice to specify, when arranging for someone to meet you, a slightly unorthodox time. Your ride to the airport is more likely to be punctual if you say 7:35 instead of 7:30. If you were back in the CIA, Bill revealed, you'd say 7:33. When you arrive at an untested lecture venue, he advised, be blunt. I see dinner's at 6. Will they be serving wine? Now, Emerson, who wasn't wrong about everything, devoted a book to representative men, men who epitomized some essential quality. Shakespeare, the poet. Napoleon, the man of the world. Goethe, or the writer. Bill was, in Emerson's sense, a representative man. One cannot quite imagine Emerson getting his mind around a character like William F. Buckley Jr. But if one can conjure up a less gaseous redaction of Emerson, one may suppose him writing an essay called Buckley, or The Conservative. Now, I hasten to add that by conservative, I do not mean any narrow partisan affiliation. True enough, Bill was known above all as a conservative, the man who did as much as anyone to rescue American conservatism from irrelevance. And that's all very well, but unfortunately, the term conservative, like its opposite number, liberal, has degenerated into an epithet, positive or negative, depending upon the communion of the person who wields it, but virtually without content. Being conservative may commit one to certain political positions or moral dogmas, but it also, and perhaps more importantly, disposes one to a certain attitude toward life. And here we come to the earthly delights. The 19th century English writer Walter Bagehot touched upon one essential aspect of the conservative disposition when, in an essay on Scott, he observed that the essence of Toryism is enjoyment. Whatever else it was, Bill's life was an affidavit of enjoyment, a record of, an homage to a life greatly and gratefully enjoyed. What delight he took in everything, playing the piano or harpsichord, savoring a glass of Vino Verde, dissecting the latest news from Washington, inspecting with wonder the capabilities of email and the internet service on a BlackBerry handheld. At the center of Bill's conservatism was the subject of this conference, his Catholicism. Now, our secular age is unfriendly to Catholics, and indeed to religion generally. But the irony is that secularists are often less jubilantly worldly than their Jewish and Christian compatriots. God made the world and saw that it was good. That bulletin from Genesis might have been the motto of Bill's life. He certainly did everything he could to broadcast it among his many friends. I've never known a more generous person. And I don't mean only materially generous, although Bill's largesse in that department was legendary. I mean spiritually, constitutionally generous as well. Bill's generosity was perhaps most solicitous in matters touching on religious faith. I think of his account, alternately moving and amusing, of the last days of his National Review colleague Frank Meyer. In his last illness, Meyer struggled with the momentous decision of whether to convert to Catholicism. Bill was a tireless emissary between Meyer and various confidants. Bill reports that Meyer, from his bed of woe, complained that the only remaining intellectual obstacle to his conversion was the collectivist implication lurking in the formulation of the communion of saints and the Apostles' Creed. Well, 2 days before the end, Meyer somehow overcame that final obstacle, partly, I like to think, with the help of Bill's armory of arguments. Another anecdote. Everyone knows that Bill commanded a formidable vocabulary. It was significant, therefore, that he should have telephoned us once in search of a word. It means taking pleasure in the misfortune of others, he said to my wife. Schadenfreude, she ventured. That's it, he said, and rang off. But how perfectly Buckley asked that he should have forgotten it. It named an emotion that was as foreign to him as joy was native. My point is that Bill Buckley was an affirmative, not an apophatic character. A few years ago at Easter, I wrote a brief essay for my weblog about the most mysterious threshold of transcendence, time. I began with St. Augustine, who famously observed in the Confession that so long as no one asks me, I know what it is. But as soon as I try to say what time is, I'm baffled. Einstein said that time is what the clock measures. True enough, but not obviously helpful in addressing the bafflement Augustine named. Still, implied by Einstein's pedestrian definition is an awful fact, that time passes, sweeping all that it contains, if contains is the right word, before it. In one tantalizing passage, Augustine suggests that time may be an extension of the mind itself. Whatever else that might mean, it pays obeisance to an oft-noted fact about our experience of time, that it is deeply implicated with the movements of our own mind, that it differs radically from one moment to the next, from one phase of life to the next. In a used bookshop somewhere a couple of years ago, I picked up a book enticingly called Why Life Speeds Up as You Get Older. It's by a Dutch psychologist whose name I cannot pronounce, but which looks more or less like Dracula, so that's what I'm going to call it. It is full of interesting facts and speculations about, as the book's subtitle puts it, how memory shapes our past. How indeed. Memory, Dracula quotes another Dutch aphorist as saying, is like a dog that lies down where it pleases. Now, Easter, the occasion for this little piece, whatever else it is a festival about time's passing, taking that phrase and all the rich multiplicity implied in the word passing. Dracula's book presents lots of fascinating psychological case studies. Much briefer, yet unaccountably more poignant, I think, is a little poem I discovered in one of John Julius Norwich's Christmas crackers. It is, he tells us, inscribed on the pendulum of a clock in a church in Kent. And it goes like this. When, as a child, I laughed and wept, time crept. When, as a youth, I dreamed and talked, time walked. When I became a full-grown man, time ran. And later, as I older grew, time flew. Soon shall I find, when traveling on, time gone. Will Christ have saved my soul by then? Amen. I sent my little reflection on time, including that poem, to Bill, and he responded acknowledging the poignancy of the sentiments expressed. During that last year or so of his life, I suspect that Bill's quotidian attitude toward time took on a darker hue. But eschatologically, as it were, I like to think that it remained gloriously affirmative. A few years ago, no, actually it was a couple of decades ago, you see how time speeds up as you get older, I went to an exhibition of art from the Vatican at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was a splendid exhibition, and among the more memorable works was a tapestry based on some cartoons by Raphael. They portrayed the works of time. Traditionally, time is most often presented as the enemy of achievement, the great, all-devouring preterite, the force that transforms every tomorrow into yesterday and inscribes futility into the core of every ambition. Now, time does have that quality, but to focus exclusively on the world-consuming quality of time is to make the mistake that Macbeth made in his famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. Raphael presented another, more salubrious, more joyful side of time's career. For time is not only the grave of every hope, it is also the condition of every success. That grain should ripen or love blossom is a gift of time. It is only a version of nihilism that discounts time, the source of every worldly benefaction, for the sake of time, the ultimate repository of every merely worldly aim. I thought about this when just a few weeks ago, I visited Bill in Pat Buckley's grave in Sharon, Connecticut. The Buckley family plot is in the old Catholic cemetery down in Sharon Valley, the unfashionable working class part of that tony town. You drive to the end of the small enclosure, and there on the right are the squat granite posts marking out this tiny piece of terminal real estate. The 5-foot metal cross that Bill had on his lawn in Stamford stands at the head of the plot and contains Pat's ashes. Bill is interred below. The day we visited was gloriously bright and balmy, spring in its fullest panoply, but the cemetery was well shaded by a profusion of trees, as tranquil and unhurried a spot as one can imagine. The perfect resting place, I thought, for these two over-energetic, intensely social souls. The Catholic Bill Buckley was a prodigy of engagement with the world. Now that his pilgrimage is complete, how appropriate that he should be reposing in this modest, unworldly, self-effacing glen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball, for those moving, eloquent thoughts. I hope you will entertain some questions.
Absolutely.
From our
Questions, animadversions, comments, complaints, the whole lot.
Does anyone like to begin?
Did you or did Bill Buckley ever contemplate the fact that the Tridentine Mass seemed to disappear overnight, almost in a revolution, whereas the effort to restore it seems to have to go through multiple layers of approval and is proving to be very difficult, as being with the hostility of a number of bishops. And there are many people who seem to want it, but are meeting this kind of resistance.
I don't remember Bill ever dilating on that fact, but I think he would acknowledge it and possibly quote Edmund Burke or someone about the fact that all of the products of civilization are very easy to destroy. They can be destroyed overnight, as you say, but once gone, they're very difficult to restore, which is why all the products of civilization, including something as civilizational as the Tridentine Mass, needs not simply to be acknowledged, but thoughtfully preserved. The work of, I think, preserving culture is a full-time job. One needs to man the ramparts, as it were, 24/7, as National Review likes to put it about their own work in that regard. Yes.
I would just like to comment on the Tridentine Mass I grew up with, which was not very edifying. That is to say, the hymns we had to sing were just as bad, if not worse, than some of the things we sing today. I agree with you about the handshake of peace and all that, but if you had to say a mass, as I did, for a congregation of hundreds, and you had to do it every hour on the hour, it was not a very edifying thing for you. And if people really knew what was going on, it wasn't for them. One of the best stories I know of the High Mass, which is really, I think, the Trinity High Mass is really the cultural embodiment that you're speaking of. Professor David Salvaregina, who wrote a book called Why Catholics Can't Sing, tells when he was a boy in Philadelphia, he went with his parents to the 9 o'clock Mass in their church. And it was quite full, I guess. And the pastor came out and said, through a problem of scheduling, this will be the High Mass. And the 10 o'clock Mass, or the 10:30 will be the Low Mass. 2/3 of the people got up and walked out. Why? Because you couldn't tell what was going on. The music was often Italian opera of the worst kind. And it just took a long, long time. And you didn't know what was going on. And you didn't know what to do. Should I sit now or should I stand? Or am I supposed to kneel now? So on the one hand, I agree. And I mean, if a priest could say Mass, but still rushing a bit in a half an hour for 3 or 4 people. But that was not the ordinary thing you encountered. The present arrangement, I think, as I say, if it's done well, it will do. And I think the translations are bad, or not good, and the scripture lessons are, as Father Newhouse said, clunky. And, but there are, if you were, at least from my point of view, I had to, last Corpus Christi, a year ago, I said Mass, I sang Mass in the Trinity Rite, which I had not said for, what, since '67. And I came away saying, I prefer this rite. Maybe in Latin, fine. Say it in Latin if you want. And again, there's another thing. I was told that in the Society of St. Peter, which has the right always to say the Trinity Mass, they will teach you how to, they will class on Latin in their parish. Well, let me tell you, we never had that. They never explained anything to us. And if you had your missal, and it would say this should be green or red, and you looked up, the priest was saying a black Mass, and you said, why is that? And you didn't know. And no one had explained it to you. So even if you were trying to follow the Mass in your missal, often enough, the first time I saw the Mass celebrated as it should be in the old rite was here, and that's why I'm a monk here.
Thank you for that. I don't know what to say exactly, except that I would certainly agree with you that that the church has often not been as effective an educator as it should be. which may account for some of the reason that, some of the fact that many people don't understand what's going on. Personally, having witnessed both rites, I find the actual internal liturgy of the Tridentine Mass much more powerful, as I said, much more stately and compelling, a much richer experience. But there's room for disagreement about that.
Though obviously the Epimass predates my experience here or anywhere for that matter. Nonetheless, like Maurice Barron, the famous English novelist, what led into the Catholic faith was a simple, quiet, and beauty, a very low Catholic Mass he experienced as a man in England in the turn of the century. So the low Mass is certainly quiet and beauty of itself. That lacks the grandeur of the High Mass and the majesty of the High Mass, but yet a certain quality also.
I'm sorry, who was it you were talking about?
Maurice
Oh, Maurice Barron, yes, right. Yves Lenoir once reflected that he would always try to go to Mass wherever he was in the world, and he was a great world traveler. And one of the things that he found consoling, pre-Vatican II, was the fact that the Mass was in Latin. That it was that universality was a great appeal. I studied Latin in high school, in a Jesuit high school, so it doesn't seem particularly foreign to me. And as an altar boy, we had to memorize the prayers and so on back then. But I don't know what it would be like if you didn't know any Latin. I mean, personally, I think that everyone should, but I'm not in a position to mandate that. Yes, sir.
I think John Paul II was really revolutionary, but yet many of us didn't realize it when he was going through his papacy. Did William F. Buckley have a sense of that and appreciate that as we do now looking in retrospect?
I don't think I ever spoke to Bill about that. I mean, so you may have, I just don't know. Jim would probably be in a better position than I to opine about that. He didn't mention it. Talked about the magisterium of the church somewhat, but never particularized it that I recall, to me. Yes, sir.
First, I'd like to say I actually agree with Bill Buckley on his views of the peace signing during the Mass. It's something I grew up with, of course, but it is sort of a distraction. But as far as my question, what was his views on the post-Vatican II Mass as it relates to young Catholics? Did he see it as a deterrent, or did he see it as something that might be better suited for the younger generation to galvanize them with the faith?
Well, again, I don't know that he ever addressed that question to me as such. I think that first of all, his aesthetic distaste for the contemporary liturgy was so profound that I'm not sure that he would allow himself to entertain the possibility that it could be a beneficent
Anyway.
ceremony. Bill was a devout person, profoundly so, but as I said, also the opposite of ostentatious about it. I mean, he was a very worldly person too, and one of the things that is most interesting about him, I think, is the way in which he managed to, those two things managed to coexist in him and without friction. Yes, sir.
I'd like a couple of comments. I like the Kiss of Peace, and I think I look at the parish as being a religious community.
That's even worse than that.
I will tell you that when I came to Portsmouth as a boy in 1963, I started saying, as an altar boy, I served Mass here. The monks engaged in a Kiss of Peace. And it really, that greeting and whatnot grew out of that tradition. I think it's a good one, and it establishes the Catholic parish as a community. I think that's very important. I'm a church musician. I do a lot of singing, and I really rue the fact that most Catholics in church do not sing, because again, I think that's part of participating in the Mass.
Right. Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, if they do sing, then you might rue the fact that they did.
I don't think so.
Anything anything else? So, Jim, you have
This is not a question, but just something that's relevant to what we've just been talking about. In Washington for 15 years, I went to a licit Tridentine Mass. And
illicit or licit?
Licit.
Licit, yes. Mm-hmm.
And what struck me were the number of young families, husbands and wives who had no childhood experience in it, who would be there with their children Sunday in and Sunday out, a substantial proportion of the total numbers attending. And there was something about the mystery, the majesty, that obviously struck them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, Bill dilated on this in his essay on the end of the Latin Mass. It was written in right in '67, I think. And I think he's right when he says that, relevance is fine. If you, in the effort to make the Mass more relevant, more understandable, those are laudable goals. But there's a difference between making something more relevant and trivializing it, and I think he felt that that's what had happened. And then there's another thing too, which is, I quoted Walter Bagehot, and Bagehot, I think maybe his most famous mode is that about the British monarchy is that we must not let daylight in upon mystery. And there's a big difference between the mystery of the Mass, which is endless, and mystification. Mystification is a bad thing. The preservation of mystery, when it's essential to something, I think is a good thing. And I think that mystery is more successfully maintained in myself in the old rite. And part of that, I think, is the fact that you're saying it in a language that's a couple thousand years old, and there's something about the whole structure of it that is more successful. But I'm not surprised that this Tridentine Mass that you mentioned was fully subscribed, because I think that people respond to that. Yes, in the back.
If I could just make a comment, I'm not in any way affiliated with the Abbey here, the first time I've been here, but I'd like to put a plug in for what they're trying to do here as far as educating our young people, because I couldn't help think when Father was speaking that our young people have to be educated. They prefer hard rock to Beethoven, and if nobody educates them to the fact that Beethoven is worth listening to, they won't go. If nobody educates them to the beauty of the Latin Mass, obviously when there's a high Mass they're going to leave. And I would also point out that my observation is nothing's changed. We have a short Mass now, it's in the vernacular, but those who leave still leave, and those who stay still stay.
Very well put. Well, I think actually one of the biggest tasks of education, something that's perhaps gone by the boards in this age of multiculturalism and political correctness, is the central task of educating one's desires, so that people want the right things. That's kind of Aristotelian language, very unfashionable, but I think it's essential for any true liberal arts education. Part of freeing people, which is what's the essence of the liberal arts education, is to free them to want the right things and to be able to distinguish not only between right and wrong, but between Beethoven and Snoop Doggy Dogg. Who was it who said of a teacher at some Ivy League school that complaining that he thinks that some books are more worth reading than others, and that was a criticism. But I think that that the education of the sensibility in that way is certainly key to any education worthy of the name. Is there? I can't tell if that's a hand up or somebody on the. Yes, sir.
I was glad that Judge Buckley went to illicit, not an illicit Mass. But
this Chatham House rules here. This is awesome.
And how did his brother end up going to Lourdes, and what was his impressions of that?
Well, he wrote a long essay about that in, gosh, I think it was first published maybe in Ne'er My God to Thee, but it also is in Miles Gone By, the big sort of autobiography. He, it was in the 80s, I think, the early 80s. I can't remember exactly when it was. He went with a few friends to find out about it. You know, were the claims credible? He gives a little history of the origin of the shrine, discusses some of the skeptical reactions to it, and you know, ponders in the best Buckley sort of way its credibility, and comes out by saying that there's certainly something there that you know, there's more there than meets the eye, even though I think I remember the statistic correctly, that something like 1 in 15,000 people is actually cured, so not a very high. It's sort of like, I think he said, like buying a lottery ticket. But people go to Lourdes, there's a kind of a spiritual nimbus around the place in a way that there's not, I remember he used this analogy, in a way there's not still at Delphi, where the oracle used to speak. Plutarch had an essay on the cessation of the oracle at Delphi. Why, way back then, it had been a religious shrine. It became a kind of museum. Why is that? Plutarch has various speculations, but it's clear that Lourdes is a special place, and that really is what the essay is about. Yes, sir.
Way back in the recesses of my Buckley mind, there's a area that says he was very interested in the Shroud of Turin.
Yes.
Enlighten us on his plans about that.
Well, I don't know all the details, but he was very interested in it. I think he actually even was involved somehow in a scientific investigation of it. Wrote about it, of course. I mean, Bill didn't do anything that he didn't write about, but I don't remember the details of it. Maybe someone else here can enlighten us, but he certainly was very interested in it. Yes, sir.
In the mass that you attended, was the consecration performed with the priest back to some people? If so, did he express an opinion about that?
It was, and he didn't. Yes, sir.
Short and simple question, but might warrant a longer and more complicated answer. As you are a columnist and an author, can you talk about just the influence that William Buckley had on your literary career?
Well, yes, actually, it's a pretty short answer. I mean, not much, really. When I met Bill, I can't remember exactly when I met him, but we became friendly, I think, in the early part of this millennium. As I said, I lived quite close to him. We would sail together occasionally. In fact, then I bought his boat eventually. But my sort of literary career, such as it is, was already established. I wrote for National Review before I even met Bill. So his influence in that sense was not great. I mean, I had read him from a fairly tender age. Always admired his sprightly mind and lucid style, but I was never, not having worked for him or not being part of his professional life really. I was never came under his wing in that sense. Thank you very much.
Genitore, Virgo prius aquos nerius, Gabriel Isabore, Subens iludave, Erratorum